The air in Natchez, Mississippi hung thick and wet even before sunrise, clinging to skin like a second layer of cloth. June had arrived with the promise of brutal heat, the kind that made cotton bolls swell fat and white and men's tempers flare like struck matches. The Harrington Plantation sprawled across 300 acres of prime delta land, its fields stretching toward the Mississippi River like a green ocean frozen in time. But it was the oak tree that everyone remembered. It stood at the edge of the eastern field, gnarled and ancient, its roots drinking deep from the riverbank below. Spanish moss draped from its branches like funeral shrouds, swaying in the pre-dawn breeze. The slaves called it the witness tree, though never within earshot of the master. It had been there longer than anyone could remember, longer than the plantation itself, perhaps longer than the stolen people who now worked the land it shaded. And every morning, without fail, two figures knelt beneath it. Isaac was a tall man, broad-shouldered despite the meager rations, his hands calloused from years of pulling cotton from thorny bowls. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. His real name had been lost the day the slave ship left the Gold Coast, replaced with something easier for white tongues to manage. But in his eyes there was something that hadn't been taken, a quiet fire, a determination that made even the overseer uneasy. Martha was smaller, her skin the color of polished mahogany, her hair wrapped tight beneath a faded headscarf. She moved through the fields with a grace that seemed out of place among the brutality, humming melodies that sounded like they belonged to another world entirely. The other slaves said she had been a healer's daughter before she was stolen. Some said she still knew things, the kind of things that made people nervous. They had met 7 years ago on a sweltering August day when Isaac collapsed from heatstroke in the fields. Martha had brought him water, whispered something over him, and within minutes he was standing again. From that day forward, they were inseparable. The master didn't care. Productive slaves were productive slaves, and these two never caused trouble. But they did have one habit that made people uncomfortable. Every morning, an hour before the work bell rang, they walked to the witness tree and knelt together in the grass. Hand in hand they prayed, eyes closed, faces turned toward the eastern horizon where the sun would soon rise. Their lips moved in unison, forming words that weren't quite English, weren't quite anything the other slaves recognized. It sounded like scripture mixed with something older, something that predated the King James Bible the master kept locked in his study. "Oh, what do you think they sayin' out there?" whispered Dinah one morning, watching from the cabin doorway as the two figures disappeared into the mist. Old Benjamin, his back scarred from decades of the lash, shook his head slowly. "Ain't our business to know, but I tell you this, whatever they prayin' for, they've been prayin' hard, real hard." "You think it's dangerous?" asked Samuel, a younger man who'd been brought up from Louisiana just 6 months prior. Benjamin's face grew serious. "Boy, when people pray that hard for that long, something's got to give. Either heaven answers or hell does." Sunday, June the 2nd, 1844, arrived like any other morning, except it wasn't. The air felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made dogs whine and horses stamp nervously in their stalls. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual, as if nature itself was holding its breath. At 4:47 a.m., by the pocket watch that Master Jeremiah Harrington kept on his nightstand, Isaac and Martha left their cabin. They moved silently through the rows of identical wooden structures that housed the plantation's 63 slaves, their bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. 3 people saw them leave. Dinah, unable to sleep because of the oppressive humidity, watched through a crack in her cabin wall. She would later tell the authorities that Martha had paused at the doorway, turned back once, and smiled. Not a happy smile, but a knowing one. The kind of smile someone gives when they're about to do something irreversible. Young Samuel, who'd woken early to tend to his sick mother, saw them pass his window. He noticed that Isaac was wearing the small leather pouch he always kept hidden beneath his shirt. the one rumored to contain earth from his homeland, brought across the ocean in his mouth during the Middle Passage. And old Benjamin, sitting on his porch because his back hurt too much to lie down, watched them walk toward the witness tree. He would later swear under oath that as they passed, he heard Martha whisper 4 words. "Today, we go home." The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, that deep indigo blue that comes before true dawn. Stars still pin-pricked the darkness overhead, and the Mississippi River murmured its eternal song in the distance. Isaac and Martha reached the witness tree and took their positions. They knelt, facing east, their hands clasped together between them, their heads bowed, their lips began to move. From 50 yards away, Benjamin could see their mouths forming words, could see the intensity of their prayer reflected in every line of their bodies, but he couldn't hear what they were saying. The minutes ticked by. 5, 10, 15. The sky continued to lighten, bleeding from indigo to purple to deep rose. The first birds began their morning songs. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, signaling the approach of another day of endless labor. Isaac and Martha kept praying. Their voices, if Benjamin strained his ears, seemed to be getting louder, not shouting, something else, as if the words themselves were gaining weight, substance, power. The Spanish moss hanging from the witness tree began to sway, though there was no wind. The air around them seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from sun-baked stone. Benjamin felt a cold finger of fear trace down his spine. He stood up, his aching back forgotten, and took a step forward. That's when he saw it. The grass beneath Isaac and Martha's knees was glowing, a faint golden light that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It pulsed in rhythm with their prayer, growing brighter with each passing second. "Lord, have mercy," Benjamin whispered. The light intensified. The air crackled with electricity. And then, just as the first rays of true sunlight broke over the eastern horizon, everything went white. Benjamin threw his arm across his eyes, stumbling backward. The light was blinding, absolute, like staring into the face of God himself. It lasted only a second and maybe 2, and then it was gone. When Benjamin lowered his arm and blinked away the after-images, the space beneath the witness tree was empty. Completely, impossibly empty. Isaac and Martha were gone. For a long moment, Benjamin couldn't move. He stood frozen, his mind trying to process what his eyes had just witnessed. The grass where they'd been kneeling was still there, slightly flattened, showing the clear indentation of 2 sets of knees. But no footprints led away from the spot. No disturbed earth. No signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. "No!" Benjamin heard himself say. "No, no, no!" He ran, or rather hobbled as fast as his damaged back would allow, toward the tree. Behind him, cabin doors were opening. Other slaves, awakened by some instinct they couldn't name, emerged into the pre-dawn light. "Benjamin, what's wrong?" Dinah called out. He didn't answer. He reached the witness tree and dropped to his knees at the exact spot where Isaac and Martha had been. The grass was warm to the touch, unnaturally warm, as if someone had held a flame to it. But it wasn't burned. It was just empty. "They was right here," Benjamin said, his voice shaking. "Right here. I seen them with my own eyes. They was praying, and then there was this light, and then what?" Samuel had run up behind him, along with a dozen other slaves. Benjamin looked up at them, his aged face filled with something between terror and awe. Then God took them. By the time Master Harrington was roused from his bed at 5:30 a.m., chaos had already erupted. The overseer, a cruel man named Clayton Briggs with a face like weathered leather and a temperament to match, had been summoned to the slave quarters. He stood at the witness tree, staring at the empty space with growing fury. "You're telling me," he said slowly, dangerously, "that 2 of my best workers just disappeared?" The assembled slaves said nothing. In their world, Silence was often the safest response. "Somebody knows something," Briggs snarled. He grabbed Benjamin by the collar, yanking the old man to his feet. You said you saw them. Where'd they go?" "I told you, sir," Benjamin said, his voice steady despite his fear. "They was prayin' and then they was gone, vanished like smoke." Briggs backhanded him hard enough to split his lip. "Don't give me that voodoo nonsense. Nobody just vanishes. They ran. Where?" "There ain't no footprints, sir," Samuel spoke up, then immediately regretted it when Briggs's cold eyes fixed on him. "What did you say, boy?" I just mean, sir, if they ran, there'd be tracks. But look," Samuel pointed at the ground around the tree. "Nothing disturbed. No tracks in any direction." It was true. The morning dew had settled on the grass, and any footprints would have been clearly visible, but the only marks were the two knee-shaped indentations and a faint circle around them where the grass seemed flattened, as if by some invisible force pressing down from above. Master Harrington arrived minutes later, still in his nightclothes, his face red with anger and confusion. At 43, Jeremiah Harrington was a third-generation plantation owner, a man who believed in order, in the natural hierarchy of things, in the manifest destiny of white supremacy over all lesser races. The idea that two of his slaves could simply vanish violated everything he understood about the world. "Get the dogs," he ordered. "Search every inch of this property. Check the river, the woods, every hiding place. They can't have gone far." But even as he said it, looking at the strange, perfect emptiness beneath the witness tree, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered something he would never admit aloud. What if they didn't run at all? The bloodhounds arrived within the hour, 6 of them, lean and vicious creatures trained to track runaways through swamp and forest. Their handler, a grim-faced man named Thaddeus Cole, brought them to the witness tree and let them sniff the ground where Isaac and Martha had knelt. The dogs whined. Cole frowned, urging them forward with sharp commands. The hounds circled the spot, their noses pressed to the earth, but they refused to pick up a trail. One of them, a particularly aggressive male named Brutus, who'd never failed to find a runaway, sat down and howled, a long, mournful sound that made everyone's skin crawl. "What's wrong with them?" Harrington demanded. Cole shook his head, bewildered. "Never seen nothing like it, sir. It's like there ain't no scent to follow. These dogs can track a man through running water, but here, nothing. It's like your slaves just evaporated." "That's impossible." "Yes, sir, it is." But impossible or not, the dogs were useless. After 30 minutes of trying, Cole loaded them back into their wagon, muttering about witchcraft and dark magic under his breath. The search expanded. Briggs organized the slaves into groups, forcing them to comb through every acre of the plantation. They checked the cotton fields, the tobacco barns, the smokehouse, the stables. They searched the dense woods that bordered the property to the north, the cane brakes along the river to the east. They even dragged the shallow parts of the Mississippi, looking for bodies. Nothing. By midday, the temperature had climbed to 97 degrees. The searchers were exhausted, dehydrated, and increasingly unnerved. Rumors spread like wildfire through the slave quarters and the white overseers alike. Some said Isaac and Martha had made a deal with the devil. Others whispered about African magic, about rituals performed in secret that could open doorways to other worlds. Old Benjamin kept his mouth shut, but his mind raced. He'd seen that light. He'd felt the power radiating from beneath that tree. Whatever had happened to Isaac and Martha, it wasn't anything that could be explained by rope ladders and midnight escapes. Reverend Josiah Blackwood arrived in the afternoon, summoned by Harrington's wife, Catherine, who was deeply disturbed by the morning's events. Blackwood was the minister of Natchez First Baptist Church, a portly man in his 50s, with thinning hair and eyes that seemed perpetually suspicious of sin. He stood beneath the witness tree, his Bible clutched to his chest, and surveyed the scene with growing alarm. "Tell me everything," he said. Harrington repeated the story, the early morning prayer ritual, the unexplained disappearance, the complete absence of tracks or evidence. Blackwood listened in silence, his face growing increasingly pale. "Show me where they knelt," he said finally. Benjamin was brought forward. Reluctantly, he pointed to the exact spot, still clearly visible in the flattened grass. Blackwood approached slowly, as if the ground itself might be dangerous. He knelt down, running his fingers across the grass. When he pulled his hand back, his expression had changed from suspicion to fear. "This grass is warm," he said, "unnaturally warm. And look here." He pointed to the circular pattern around the knee impressions. "This wasn't made by feet or hands. This was made by something else." "What are you saying, Reverend?" Catherine Harrington asked, her voice trembling. Blackwood stood up, brushing the grass from his trousers. His face was grave. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm saying that what happened here this morning was not a simple escape. I've read accounts of this before, in the oldest texts, in the Apocrypha. There are stories of the faithful being taken up, translated from this world to the next without tasting death. Enoch, Elijah, and if these two slaves were truly righteous in their prayers—" "Righteous," Harrington exploded. "They were slaves, property. They don't get to be taken up by God." "Sir, I'm merely reporting what the evidence suggests. The evidence suggests they ran, and my overseer is too incompetent to find them." But even as Harrington raged, everyone present could see the doubt in his eyes, because deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he was beginning to believe that something impossible had occurred on his land that morning. That night, the plantation felt different. The slaves huddled in their cabins, speaking in hushed voices about Isaac and Martha. Some were terrified, certain that what had happened was the work of dark forces. Others felt a strange, cautious hope kindling in their chests. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of their bondage that didn't involve running through swamps and dodging bullets. "You think they really gone to heaven?" Dinah whispered to her husband Moses as they lay on their thin mattress. Moses was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said finally, "that they prayed for freedom and they got it. However that happened, wherever they are now, they free." In another cabin, Samuel sat with his sick mother, holding her frail hand. She'd been coughing up blood for weeks, her body worn out from 30 years of brutal labor. She was 47 years old, but looked 70. "Mama," Samuel said softly, "what do you know about Isaac and Martha's prayers?" His mother's eyes, roomy but still sharp, fixed on him. "I know they've been praying in the old way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way our people prayed before the white men came, before they told us we had to pray their way, to their God, in their language. What old way? The way that don't just ask for mercy in the next life, child. The way that demands justice in this one." Samuel felt a chill run through him despite the oppressive heat. "And you think their prayer was answered?" His mother smiled, and it was the first time Samuel had seen her smile in months. "I think," she said, "that when enough pain is gathered in one place, when enough tears are cried and enough blood is spilled, something has to give. Heaven has to respond, or it ain't really heaven at all." In the main house, Master Harrington sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the ledger that recorded all his human property. Isaac's name was there. Isaac, male, approximately 35 years, field hand, good health, purchased 1837 from the estate of Thomas Weatherby, $800. Martha's entry was just below. Martha, female, approximately 30 years, field hand, good health, purchased 1837, $700. $1,500 of property vanished into thin air. But it wasn't the money that bothered him most. It was the impossibility of it, the violation of natural law. Harrington was a man who believed in order, in cause and effect, in the rational progression of the world. Slaves didn't just disappear. People didn't just vanish because they prayed hard enough, and yet his wife entered the study, her face drawn with worry. "Jeremiah, people in town are already talking. The Reverend's been questioned twice by concerned citizens. They're saying we harbored practitioners of dark arts. That's ridiculous. Is it? Can you explain what happened this morning? Harrington had no answer. He took a long drink of whiskey and said nothing. The Reverend thinks we should burn the tree, Catherine continued. He says it might be tainted somehow, cursed. It's just a tree. Then explain why the grass beneath it is still warm. I touched it myself this afternoon, Jeremiah. Hours after the disappearance. It's still warm. Harrington set down his glass with a sharp click. I don't have to explain anything. This is my land, my property, and I'll handle it as I see fit. Now leave me alone. Catherine withdrew, but her words lingered in the study like smoke. Outside, the witness tree stood silent in the darkness, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed a faint golden shimmer in the air around it, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but colder somehow, ancient, waiting. 3 days passed. The search continued, though with decreasing enthusiasm. Clayton Briggs rode into Natchez and reported the incident to the county sheriff, who took down the information with skepticism barely concealed. Notices were posted offering a reward for information leading to the capture of 2 runaway slaves, but no one came forward with leads, because there were no leads to give. The other slaves returned to their work, but their songs had changed. Instead of the usual spirituals about Jordan River and crossing over, they sang new verses, verses that spoke of prayers answered, of chains broken, of 2 souls who knelt before dawn and rose with the sun. Briggs tried to stop it, threatening whippings for anyone caught singing the new songs, but it was like trying to stop the wind. The story of Isaac and Martha spread beyond the Harrington Plantation, carried by slaves who traded with neighboring properties, by freedmen who moved between the plantations and the town, by whispered conversations in the Natchez market. Within a week, slaves on 3 other plantations had started gathering at sunrise to pray at the bases of old trees. Their masters were not pleased. On the 7th day after the disappearance, old Benjamin woke before dawn with a strange compulsion. His back was hurting worse than usual, his joints stiff with arthritis, but something pulled him from his bed and drew him toward the witness tree. The plantation was silent. Even the night birds had gone quiet. The air felt charged, pregnant with possibility. Benjamin approached the tree slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The grass, where Isaac and Martha had knelt, was still slightly flattened, still warmer than the surrounding earth. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the spot, remembering the light he'd seen. And then, without really planning to, he knelt down. He wasn't sure why he did it. He was 73 years old, too old to believe in miracles, too scarred by life to hope for divine intervention. But his knees touched the warm grass, and his hands clasped together, and his eyes closed. Lord, he whispered, I don't know what you did for Isaac and Martha. I don't know if you took them home or if they found some other kind of freedom. But I'm asking you now. I'm tired. My back is broken, my body is worn out, and I got maybe 1 or 2 more years of work left in me before they throw me aside to die. If you got mercy for an old man, if you got any of that freedom left, I'm ready. He stayed there kneeling in the grass as the sky began to lighten in the east. The first birds started their morning songs. The air grew warmer, but nothing happened. No blinding light, no miraculous disappearance, just an old man kneeling in the grass, praying to a God who might or might not be listening. After 30 minutes, Benjamin's knees began to ache too badly to continue. He stood up slowly, disappointed, but not surprised. Whatever grace had been extended to Isaac and Martha apparently wasn't meant for him. He turned to head back to his cabin and froze. Standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom, were 2 figures. Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. He squinted, trying to make out their features, but they were too far away, too shrouded in shadow. But something about their shapes, their postures, was achingly familiar. Isaac? he called out softly. "Martha!" The figures didn't respond. They simply stood there, watching him. And then, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, they turned and walked into the forest. Benjamin ran after them, or tried to. His old legs couldn't move fast enough, and by the time he reached the tree line, the figures were gone. But on the trunk of a sweet gum tree, carved fresh into the bark, were 2 words. The cotton began to rot exactly 2 weeks after Isaac and Martha vanished. It started in the eastern field, the one closest to the witness tree. Clayton Briggs noticed it first during his morning inspection. Several boles that had been white and pristine the day before were now tinged with brown, their fibers turning slimy and foul-smelling. He cursed, assuming it was bole rot caused by excessive moisture, though there hadn't been rain in over a week. By the afternoon, half the eastern field was infected. By sunset, the rot had spread to the central fields. Master Harrington stood at the edge of his ruined crop, his face pale with disbelief. Cotton was the lifeblood of the plantation, the source of all his wealth and status. A bad harvest could mean financial ruin, and what he was witnessing wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. "How is this possible?" he demanded of Briggs. "We've had perfect growing conditions, no rain, no frost, no pests. The cotton was perfect yesterday." Briggs had no answer. He'd been overseeing cotton production for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. The rot wasn't following any natural pattern. It wasn't spreading from one infected area outward. Instead, it seemed to be appearing randomly throughout the fields, as if the corruption was rising up from the earth itself. "Get every hand into the fields," Harrington ordered. "Harvest what we can. Burn what's infected. Move." The slaves were roused from their evening rest and driven back into the fields with whips and curses. They worked through the night by torchlight, trying to salvage what cotton remained uninfected. But it was a losing battle. The rot spread faster than they could pick, faster than they could burn. By dawn, 3/4 of the crop was destroyed. Harrington stood in the middle of his ruined fields as the sun rose, watching smoke from the burning cotton drift across his land like a funeral shroud. The financial loss was staggering. Easily $30,000, maybe more. It was enough to bankrupt him, to force him to sell land, possibly even sell slaves to cover his debts. But worse than the financial ruin was the feeling growing in his chest, the cold certainty that this wasn't natural. This wasn't bole rot or crop disease. This was something else. This was a curse. Old Benjamin watched the burning from his cabin porch, and his weathered face showed no surprise. "It's starting," he said to Moses, who stood beside him. "Whatever Isaac and Martha set in motion, it ain't finished." "You think they're doing this?" Moses asked. "From wherever they are?" Benjamin shook his head slowly. "I think they opened a door, and now things are coming through. Balance, maybe. Justice. Call it what you want. But this land has soaked up too much suffering, too much blood and tears. Something's got to give back what was taken." The rot didn't stop with the cotton. 3 days later, the tobacco crop in the northern fields began to wither. The leaves turned black overnight, as if touched by frost, though the temperature never dropped below 70 degrees. The corn in the western fields developed strange purple-black growths that oozed a thick, foul-smelling liquid. Harrington brought in agricultural experts from Natchez, from Vicksburg, even from New Orleans. They examined the soil, tested the water, inspected the plants under magnifying glasses. None of them could explain what was happening. "It's like the land itself is dying," one expert said, packing up his equipment with shaking hands. "I've never seen anything like it. Whatever's causing this, it's not natural. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington, but I can't help you." The other plantations in the region watched with growing alarm. At first, they'd been secretly pleased by Harrington's misfortune. Competition in the cotton market was fierce, and one man's loss was another's gain. But as the days passed, and the destruction at the Harrington Plantation continued to worsen, they began to wonder if what had started there might spread. Some of the more superstitious planters began asking questions about the two slaves who'd disappeared. The story had spread through the region like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some said Isaac and Martha had been powerful voodoo practitioners who'd cursed the land before vanishing. Others claimed they'd been prophets, calling down divine judgment on their oppressors. Reverend Blackwood was called back to the plantation. He arrived with his Bible, a crucifix and a bottle of holy water, prepared to perform an exorcism if necessary. "This is God's judgment," he declared, standing in the middle of the rotting fields. "You have sinned against heaven, Mr. Harrington, and now you must face the consequences." "What sin?" Harrington roared. "I've been a faithful churchgoer, a pillar of the community. What sin could possibly warrant this destruction?" Blackwood's eyes were cold. "The sin of breaking bodies and souls for profit. The sin of calling human beings property. The sin of ignoring the cries of the oppressed." "They're slaves. It's biblical. It's the natural order." "Is it?" Blackwood gestured at the devastation surrounding them. "Then explain to me how the natural order has turned against you. Explain how crops rot in perfect growing conditions. Explain how two people can vanish into thin air after praying for deliverance." Harrington had no answer. He turned away, his shoulders slumped, looking suddenly old and fragile. That night, Blackwood attempted his exorcism. He walked the perimeter of the plantation, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers of banishment. The slaves watched from their cabins, some with hope, others with fear. But when Blackwood reached the witness tree, something stopped him. The air around the tree felt different, thicker, charged with energy. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of a few feet. His breath misted in the sudden cold, and the holy water in his bottle froze solid. "Dear God," Blackwood whispered. He tried to approach closer, to lay his hand on the trunk, but an invisible force pushed him back. It wasn't violent, wasn't aggressive, but it was absolute, like trying to walk through a solid wall. Blackwood retreated, his faith shaken, but not broken. "This is beyond my power," he told Harrington. "Whatever has taken root here, it's older and stronger than anything I've encountered. You need someone with more knowledge of other traditions." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Blackwood said carefully, "that you speak to your slaves. Ask them what Isaac and Martha were really praying for, because I don't think it was simple freedom." Master Harrington swallowed his pride the next morning and summoned old Benjamin to the main house. It was unprecedented. Slaves were never invited into the master's study, never asked for counsel or advice. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Harrington was running out of options. Benjamin entered slowly, his eyes taking in the fine furniture, the books lining the shelves, the portrait of Harrington's ancestors hanging above the fireplace. All of it purchased with the labor of stolen bodies. "Sit," Harrington said, gesturing to a chair. Benjamin remained standing. "Rather stand, if it's all the same to you, sir." Harrington's jaw tightened, but he let it pass. "Fine. I need information about Isaac and Martha. What were they praying for?" "Freedom, sir, same as all of us." "Don't play games with me, old man. Reverend Blackwood thinks they were doing something unusual, some kind of ritual. What do you know?" Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally he spoke. "Isaac and Martha weren't just praying, sir. They were making an offering. An offering of what? Themselves. Their suffering. Their pain. Every lash of the whip, every hour in the fields, every child taken and sold away, every indignity and cruelty, they gathered it all up in their prayers and offered it back. Offered it back to who? God? To whoever was listening, to whatever power governs justice in this world. They prayed that their suffering wouldn't be wasted, that it would mean something, that it would change something. Harrington felt ice forming in his stomach. "And you think their prayer was answered?" "I know it was, sir. I saw it. I saw that light take them. And now, Benjamin gestured toward the window, toward the ruined fields beyond. Now the debt is coming due. What debt? The debt this land owes to the people who worked it, who died on it, who watered it with their blood and tears. You can't take and take and take without something coming back around, sir. Isaac and Martha, they opened a door. And what's coming through that door? It's everything you took coming back to claim what's owed. Harrington stood up abruptly. Get out of my house. Benjamin left without another word, but his message lingered in the study like smoke. That night, lying in his bed, Harrington couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that tree, its branches reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. He heard whispers at the edge of hearing, voices speaking words he couldn't understand. Around 2 a.m., he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, and that's when he heard the praying. It was soft at first, barely audible, coming from somewhere outside his window. Two voices, one male and one female, speaking in unison. The words were rhythmic, hypnotic, growing gradually louder. Harrington sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The voices continued, clear as day now, right outside his window on the second floor. But when he looked out, there was nothing there. Just darkness and the distant silhouette of the witness tree against the starlit sky. The voices continued all night long, never stopping, never pausing. And when dawn finally came, Master Harrington rose from his bed with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, knowing with absolute certainty that his nightmare had only just begun. The bells started ringing at midnight exactly 1 week after the crops began to rot. Every plantation had a bell, a large iron thing mounted on a post near the main house, used to summon slaves to work, to signal emergencies, to mark the passage of time in a world where human beings were measured by their productivity. The Harrington Plantation bell was old, installed by Jeremiah's grandfather 60 years earlier, and it had a distinctive tone. Deep and mournful, like the tolling of a funeral bell. It rang 12 times at midnight, waking everyone on the plantation. Clayton Briggs was the first to investigate, stumbling out of his cottage with a lantern and a pistol, cursing whoever had the audacity to pull that rope in the middle of the night. But when he reached the bell post, he found it empty. The rope hung perfectly still, unmoving in the humid night air, and yet the bell continued to ring. Briggs stared up at it, his blood running cold. The bell's massive iron mouth swung back and forth, striking the clapper with steady, rhythmic precision. But there were no hands pulling the rope, no mechanism that could explain the movement. It was ringing itself. What in the name of... Briggs reached for the rope to still it, but the moment his fingers touched the hemp, he jerked back with a cry of pain. The rope was ice cold, so cold it burned his skin, leaving white frost marks across his palm. Master Harrington arrived minutes later, along with several of the house slaves carrying lanterns. They stood in a circle around the bell post, watching the impossible sight of a bell ringing, with no one to ring it. "Make it stop," Harrington said, his voice tight with fear. "I tried, sir," Briggs said, holding up his frost-burned hand. "Can't touch the rope." They tried everything. They threw water on the bell, thinking it might be some kind of mechanical trick. They fired shots at the rope, trying to sever it, but the bullets passed through as if the rope wasn't solid. They even attempted to climb the post and physically stop the bell's swing, but whoever tried found themselves unable to approach within 5 feet of the bell itself. An invisible barrier pushed them back. After 30 minutes, the bell finally stopped ringing on its own. It swung one final time, let out one final deep toll, and then fell still. But the silence that followed was somehow worse than the ringing. The slaves retreated to their cabins, speaking in hushed, frightened voices. They knew what this meant. They'd heard the stories from other plantations, whispered tales of hauntings and supernatural retribution. When bells rang with no hands to ring them, it meant the dead were restless. And on a plantation built on suffering and death, there were plenty of restless dead. The midnight ringing became a nightly occurrence. Every night at exactly 12 o'clock, the bell would begin tolling, and every night it would ring precisely 12 times before falling silent. The household tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but the sound was impossible to escape. It echoed across the fields, through the woods, all the way to the river. Neighboring plantations heard it. Travelers passing on the river road heard it. Within days, the story had spread through the entire county. The Harrington Plantation was haunted. But worse than the bell was what came with it. On the third night of ringing, several slaves reported seeing figures moving through the fields during the bell's tolling. Shadow shapes that walked between the cotton rows, stooping as if picking the ruined bowls, their movements slow and purposeful. "I seen them," Dinah told Moses, her voice shaking. "3 of them, out in the east field. They looked like people, but wrong somehow. Like they were there and not there at the same time." "Did you see their faces?" "No. And I didn't want to. Because I think," her voice dropped to a whisper, "I think they were the ones who died here. All the folks who've been worked to death, who've been beaten to death, who've been sold away and never seen again. I think they coming back." The sightings increased each night. More and more slaves reported seeing the phantom workers in the fields. Some said they recognized specific faces, men and women who died years ago, now returned as shadows walking the land they'd once worked. Old Benjamin saw them too. He stood on his porch one midnight, listening to the bell toll, and watched as a dozen shadow figures emerged from the woods and made their way toward the witness tree. They moved in complete silence, their feet making no sound on the earth, leaving no tracks. When they reached the tree, they formed a circle around it and knelt, and Benjamin realized with a chill that they were praying, just like Isaac and Martha had prayed. Master Harrington's mental state deteriorated rapidly. The nightly bell ringing destroyed his sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it, that deep, mournful toll that seemed to shake the very foundations of his house. He took to drinking heavily, consuming a bottle of whiskey each night in a futile attempt to drown out the sound. But he couldn't drown out the voices. They'd started the same night as the bells. 2 voices, always the same 2, praying outside his window. Sometimes they were in English, sometimes in a language he didn't recognize, but the message was always the same. Judgment was coming, debts must be paid, the suffering of the innocent cries out for justice. Catherine Harrington begged him to leave, to abandon the plantation and move to town, but he refused. This was his land, his legacy, his birthright. He wouldn't be driven off by what? Ghosts, curses, the collective delusions of frightened slaves. But late at night, alone in his study with only the whiskey for company, Harrington couldn't deny what he knew in his bones to be true. Something had been unleashed on his plantation, something that wanted revenge for generations of cruelty, and it was only getting started. On the 7th night of the bell ringing, something new happened. At midnight, when the bell began its tolling, every door in the main house flew open simultaneously. Every single one, from the front entrance to the servants' quarters to the storage rooms. The windows rattled in their frames. The chandeliers swayed as if blown by a powerful wind, though the air was perfectly still, and in the mirror above the fireplace in Harrington's study, words appeared, written in condensation that formed from nowhere. 2 souls knelt, 2 souls rose. Now the reckoning comes. Harrington stared at the message, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his whiskey glass. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't notice. He couldn't look away from those words, from the terrible promise they contained. Catherine entered the study, her face pale. "Jeremiah, we have to leave. Please, whatever this is, it's getting worse. We have to—" "No." His voice was barely a whisper. "We stay. This is my land." "Your land is cursed. Then I'll lift the curse." He turned to face her, his eyes wild. "I'll burn that damn tree. I'll salt the earth where it stands. I'll dig up every inch of this plantation if I have to, but I will not be driven from my own property by ghosts and superstition." But even as he said it, both of them could hear the bell tolling outside, could hear the phantom voices praying, could feel the presence of something vast and patient and absolutely merciless settling over the plantation like a shroud. The next morning, Harrington ordered the witness tree cut down. Clayton Briggs assembled a crew of the strongest field hands, armed them with axes and saws, and marched them to the ancient oak at dawn. The slaves were reluctant, their faces filled with fear, but they had no choice. Orders were orders, and disobedience meant the whip. Benjamin tried to warn them. "Don't do it," he said as they passed his cabin. "That tree is protected. You cut it down. Something worse gonna come." But Briggs ignored him, driving the men forward with threats and curses. They reached the witness tree just as the sun broke over the horizon. The oak stood silent and majestic, its branches spread wide, Spanish moss swaying gently in the morning breeze. In the golden light of dawn, it looked almost holy. "Cut it down," Briggs ordered. The first man approached with his axe raised. His name was Jacob, a powerful young man who could split a cord of wood in an hour. He swung the axe with all his strength, aiming for the trunk, and the blade shattered. Pieces of metal flew in all directions, one shard cutting Jacob's cheek. He stumbled back, staring at the tree trunk in disbelief. There wasn't even a scratch on the bark, not even a dent. "What the hell?" Briggs grabbed the axe from another man and swung it himself. The same thing happened. The blade shattered on impact, as if he'd tried to chop through solid iron. They tried saws. The teeth broke. They tried fire. The wood wouldn't burn. They even brought out a team of horses to pull the tree down with ropes, but the ropes snapped like thread the moment tension was applied. After 3 hours of trying, with every tool broken and every method failed, Briggs finally admitted defeat. "It won't come down," he reported to Harrington. "I don't know what kind of wood that is, but it's harder than anything I've ever seen. We can't cut it, can't burn it, can't pull it down. It's staying right where it is." Harrington said nothing. He simply stared out his study window at the distant oak, and something in his expression suggested he'd given up. Not just on removing the tree, but on everything. On fighting whatever forces had been unleashed, on maintaining control, on pretending that the natural order would protect him. That night, the bell rang 13 times instead of 12. And the voices outside Harrington's window were joined by others. A chorus of the dead, all praying in unison, their words rising and falling like a terrible hymn. The plantation workers, both slave and free, huddled in their respective dwellings, and no one slept, because everyone knew, with the certainty that comes from primal fear, that something was building toward a climax. The bell, the voices, the phantom workers, the indestructible tree, it was all leading somewhere. And when it arrived, there would be no escaping it. The first witness arrived from Vicksburg on a humid Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Isaac and Martha's disappearance. His name was Solomon Gray, and he was a free black man. One of the rare few who'd purchased his own freedom and made a life for himself as a skilled carpenter. But he was known for something else in the black communities of Mississippi. He was a keeper of stories, a collector of histories that white folks didn't want remembered. He'd heard about the Harrington Plantation. Everyone had. Solomon stood at the property line, looking across the ruined fields toward the witness tree in the distance, and he felt something pulling at him. A compulsion he couldn't explain, as if the land itself was calling to him. He walked through the open gate. No one stopped him. The white overseers were too exhausted and frightened to care about trespassers anymore, and made his way through the devastated cotton fields. Up close, the destruction was even more complete than the rumors suggested. The earth itself looked sick, the plants twisted and blackened, and the air carried a faint smell of decay. When he reached the tree, old Benjamin was already there, sitting on the grass with his back against the trunk. "You felt it too?" Benjamin asked without looking up. "Felt what?" "The calling. This place is gathering witnesses." "Witnesses to what?" Benjamin finally looked at him, his old eyes gleaming with something between fear and satisfaction. To the accounting. When judgment comes, someone got to see it, someone got to remember and tell the story after. That's why you hear. That's why others will come. And Benjamin was right. Over the next week, more people arrived. Most were black, former slaves, free people, traveling preachers, healers, and storytellers. But some were white, abolitionists from the North, Quakers, journalists from progressive newspapers who'd heard the impossible stories and needed to see for themselves. They came from Tennessee, from Louisiana, from as far away as Kentucky. They set up camps along the property line, drawn by rumors of miracles and curses, of divine judgment and supernatural retribution. The Harrington Plantation, once a symbol of Southern prosperity, had become a pilgrimage site. Master Harrington tried to drive them off at first, sending Briggs and his men to clear the trespassers. But there were too many, and they kept coming. More importantly, many carried papers, documentation of their free status, letters of introduction from prominent citizens, even legal writs allowing them access to document what was happening. The story had grown too big to contain. A journalist from the New York Tribune arrived with a daguerreotype camera, setting up his equipment to photograph the witness tree and the ruined fields. His name was William Thatcher, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "I've covered fires, floods, and epidemics," he told Solomon Gray as they stood together watching the tree. "But I've never seen anything like this. The crops rotting overnight, the bell that rings itself, the reports of apparitions. If I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes, I'd have dismissed it as mass hysteria." "But you have seen it," Solomon said. "Yes, and now I have to figure out how to write about it in a way that won't get me committed to an asylum." That night, Thatcher got his answer. At midnight, when the bell began its nightly tolling, he was ready with his camera. The flash powder ignited, capturing the moment in silver nitrate and light. But when he developed the plate later, what appeared in the image made his hands shake. The bell was ringing, yes, but surrounding it, clearly visible in the photograph though invisible to the naked eye, were dozens of translucent figures, men, women, and children, all dressed in the rough clothing of field slaves, all standing in a circle around the bell-post. And they were all looking directly at the camera. Thatcher showed the photograph to Solomon, who studied it in silence for a long moment. "These are the ones who died here," Solomon said finally. "Every person worked to death, beaten to death, separated from their families and broken. They've been waiting, and now Isaac and Martha's prayer has given them a voice. But what do they want? Same thing Isaac and Martha wanted. Justice, acknowledgement, for their suffering to mean something, to be remembered, to matter." Inside the main house, the Harringtons were falling apart. Catherine had stopped eating, her face gaunt and hollow. She spent her days in bed, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound. The servants whispered that she'd gone mad, that she'd talked to herself constantly, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Jeremiah was worse. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in days, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He'd taken to walking the plantation at night with a loaded rifle, shouting challenges at the shadows, demanding that whatever was haunting him show itself so he could fight it properly. But you can't fight the dead with bullets. On the night of the full moon, exactly 1 month after Isaac and Martha vanished, something changed. The witnesses gathered near the witness tree as they did every evening, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough to observe. The air felt different tonight, charged with electricity, as if a storm was approaching though the sky was clear. At midnight, the bell began to ring. But this time, it didn't stop at 12 or even 13 tolls. It kept ringing, the sound growing louder and more insistent with each strike. The witnesses covered their ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside their heads, as much as from the bell itself. And then, in the space beneath the witness tree, the air began to shimmer. Old Benjamin saw it first. "Look," he said, pointing with a trembling finger. "They coming back." The shimmer intensified, and suddenly 2 figures were standing beneath the tree, exactly where they'd knelt a month before. Isaac and Martha. They looked exactly as they had the morning they disappeared. Isaac tall and strong, Martha graceful and serene. But there was something different about them now, something that made everyone who looked upon them feel instinctively that these were not quite the same people who'd left. They glowed with a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from within. Their eyes, when they opened them, were filled with an otherworldly knowledge. And when Martha spoke, her voice carried across the entire plantation despite being barely above a whisper. "We have been sent back to witness," she said. "To see the harvest that was planted in our prayers." Isaac raised his hand, pointing toward the main house. "The time of reckoning has come. Let all who have gathered here bear witness to what justice demands." The front door of the main house flew open, and Jeremiah Harrington came stumbling out. He'd heard the voices, had felt the compulsion pulling at him like a physical force. He couldn't have stayed inside if he'd wanted to. He walked across the yard, past the ruined fields, toward the witness tree and the crowd of people gathered there. His rifle hung loosely in one hand, forgotten. His eyes were fixed on Isaac and Martha, and his face showed a mixture of terror and something else, perhaps relief that the waiting was finally over. When he was 10 feet from the tree, Isaac spoke. "Jeremiah Harrington, do you know us?" Harrington's voice came out as a croak. You're the ones who ran away." "Isaac and Martha." "We did not run," Martha said. "We prayed and we were answered. We were taken from this place of suffering and shown the truth of what has been done here. Now we return to deliver testimony." "Testimony?" Harrington laughed, a desperate, brittle sound. "To who? There's no court here, no judge." "There is always a judge," Isaac said, "and the court is this land itself, which has drunk the blood and tears of the innocent for too long. We are not here to punish you, Jeremiah Harrington. We are here to make you remember." Isaac and Martha joined hands and began to pray, but this was different from their morning ritual. This prayer wasn't a request or a plea. It was a summoning. The ground beneath the witness tree began to glow with that same golden light. It spread outward in concentric circles, washing over the witnesses, over the ruined fields, over the entire plantation, and as it touched each person present, they saw. They saw the history of this land. They saw the first slaves brought here in chains, terrified and confused, ripped from their homes across an ocean. They saw families torn apart on the auction block, children sold away from mothers, husbands separated from wives. They saw the whippings, the brandings, the casual cruelty inflicted daily by men who considered themselves good Christians. They saw the woman who'd been worked in the fields until the day she went into labor, who'd given birth between the cotton rows and was expected back at work the next morning. They saw the man who'd been beaten to death for learning to read. They saw the young girl sold to a neighboring plantation to pay off gambling debts, screaming for her mother as the wagon carried her away. They saw 2 centuries of suffering compressed into minutes, an avalanche of pain and horror that made strong men fall to their knees and hardened witnesses weep openly. And Jeremiah Harrington saw all of it too, but for him it was worse, because he didn't just see the suffering. He felt it. Every lash of the whip that had been delivered on his property, he felt across his own back. Every separation, every loss, every moment of degradation and despair experienced by the people his family had enslaved. He felt it all, hundreds of lifetimes of agony compressed into his single consciousness. He screamed, he fell to the ground, his body convulsing, his mind unable to process the magnitude of what he was experiencing. The rifle fell from his hand, forgotten. The vision lasted 5 minutes by William Thatcher's pocket watch, though it felt like hours to those experiencing it. When it finally faded, the golden light receding back into the earth beneath the tree, every person present was changed. They had witnessed, they had seen, and they would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Harrington lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his face wet with tears. When he finally managed to look up, Isaac and Martha were still standing there, watching him with expressions that held no hatred, no triumph, only a profound sadness. "Now you know," Martha said softly. "Now you understand what was done here, what your wealth was built upon. We did not curse this land, Jeremiah Harrington. The curse was already here in every chain, every whip, every broken family. We only made it visible." "What do you want from me?" Harrington whispered. "We want nothing from you," Isaac said. "The debt cannot be repaid, not truly, but it can be acknowledged, it can be remembered. And those who come after can choose a different path." "I'll free them," Harrington said, suddenly, desperately. "All of them, every slave on this plantation, I'll set them free right now." "That is a beginning," Martha said. "But freedom alone does not heal what was broken. You must tell the truth of what happened here. You must ensure that this suffering is not forgotten, not minimized, not excused. You must bear witness, as we have borne witness." Isaac raised his hand again, and this time he pointed not at Harrington, but at the assembled crowd, at Solomon Gray, at William Thatcher, at old Benjamin, at all the witnesses who had been drawn to this place. "You have seen," he said, his voice carrying power that made the very air vibrate. "You have witnessed the truth. Now you must tell it. You must write it, speak it, teach it to your children and your children's children. What happened here, what happened on this plantation and 1,000 others like it, must never be forgotten. That is how justice is served. Not through vengeance, but through remembrance." The golden light began to intensify around Isaac and Martha again. Their forms started to become translucent, fading like morning mist in sunlight. "Wait!" Benjamin called out, struggling to his feet. "Are you leaving again? Where are you going?" Martha turned to him with a gentle smile. "We go where all the faithful go when their work is done. We go home, to the real home, not the one that was stolen from us. But we leave behind a gift." She gestured toward the witness tree, and suddenly everyone could see what had been invisible before. Carved into the trunk, in letters that seemed to glow with their own light, were hundreds of names. The names of every person who had suffered and died on the Harrington Plantation, every soul whose life had been consumed by this place. "Let this tree stand as a memorial," Isaac said. "Let no one forget who these people were, what they endured, what was taken from them, and let anyone who comes here with a sincere heart and kneels to pray as we prayed be given a vision of truth, so that this history lives forever." The light grew blinding, and when it cleared, Isaac and Martha were gone. But this time, they had left something behind. A tree transformed into a monument, bearing witness to the suffering of the forgotten, ensuring that their stories would be told. The sun rose over the Harrington Plantation on a morning that felt like the first morning after the end of the world. Jeremiah Harrington had not moved from where he'd collapsed. He sat in the grass near the witness tree, staring at nothing, his mind still reeling from the visions he'd experienced. Around him, the witnesses were stirring, speaking in hushed voices, trying to process what they'd seen. William Thatcher sat with his notebook, writing furiously. His hands shook, and his writing was barely legible, but he couldn't stop. He had to get it all down while the memories were fresh, every detail, every name, every moment of the vision that had been seared into his consciousness. Solomon Gray approached the tree slowly, reverently. He ran his fingers over the carved names, reading them aloud in a low voice. Elijah, Grace, Samuel, Rebecca, James. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one a life that had been lived and lost on this cursed soil. Old Benjamin stood beside him, tears streaming down his weathered face. "They remembered," he whispered. "Someone finally remembered their names." Clayton Briggs had witnessed everything from a distance, and the vision had broken something fundamental in him. The overseer who'd wielded the whip with such casual cruelty now sat with his head in his hands, sobbing like a child. He would never touch another human being in anger for the rest of his life. As the morning progressed, the slaves of the Harrington Plantation emerged from their cabins. They'd felt the vision too, though perhaps less intensely than those who'd been standing near the tree. They approached cautiously, unsure what had changed, but sensing that something fundamental had shifted. Master Harrington finally stood up. He looked like he'd aged 20 years overnight, his face gaunt and grey. He walked slowly toward the slave quarters, and every eye followed him. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "You're free," he said, "all of you. As of this moment, you are no longer property of this plantation. I will draw up the papers today. You can stay and work for wages if you choose, or you can leave. The choice is yours." There was a long moment of stunned silence. Then Dinah spoke up, her voice strong and clear. "And what about everything that was taken from us? All the years of labor, of suffering? You just say, 'You're free,' and that makes it right." Harrington flinched as if struck. "No," he said quietly, "nothing makes it right, nothing can. But I will deed portions of this land to those who worked it. I will use what wealth remains to establish a school, open to all children regardless of color. I will spend what's left of my life trying to—" His voice broke. "Trying to make amends that can never truly be made." "Pretty words," Moses said, his arm around Dinah. "But we've heard pretty words before." "Then watch my actions," Harrington said. "Judge me by what I do, not what I say. I cannot undo the past, but perhaps I can help build a different future." Benjamin stepped forward. "The land is still cursed," he said. "The crops won't grow here, not anymore. This place has soaked up too much suffering. It can't sustain life the way it did before." "I know," Harrington said. "Let it remain fallow then. Let it serve as a reminder of what was done here, and let that tree stand as a memorial for all time." In the days and weeks that followed, the Harrington Plantation became something unprecedented in the South of 1844, a place where black people gathered freely to remember, to mourn, and to bear witness. Solomon Gray organized the first memorial service, held beneath the witness tree on a Sunday morning. Former slaves from neighboring plantations came, along with free black people from Natchez and Vicksburg. They sang spirituals, they prayed, they told stories of those whose names were carved in the tree trunk, and they made plans. "What happened here can't just be a local story," Solomon said at a gathering in the abandoned fields. "The whole country needs to know. The whole world needs to know." William Thatcher agreed. His article had already been sent to the Tribune, but he knew one article wasn't enough. "I'll write a book," he said. "A full accounting of everything that happened here, everything we witnessed. And I'll include the names, all the names from that tree." "They'll say it's fiction," someone pointed out. "They'll say it's abolitionist propaganda." "Let them say what they want," Thatcher replied. "I have my photographs. I have the testimony of dozens of witnesses. And I have the truth. That has to count for something." A young woman named Sarah, who'd been born on the plantation, spoke up. "We should teach the children. My mother never got to read, never got to write. But I learned some, in secret. We could start a school like Master Harrington promised, make sure our children know their history, know the names of their ancestors." "Not just black children," Solomon added. "White children too. Especially white children. They need to know what their grandfathers did, what their wealth was built on. Only way to break the cycle is through education." Old Benjamin listened to all of this with a quiet smile. He was dying. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his breath came shorter each day. But he would live long enough to see this, to see his people taking the tragedy of the Harrington Plantation and transforming it into something that could change the future. 3 months after Isaac and Martha's second disappearance, the Harrington Plantation School opened its doors. It was housed in the former overseer's cottage, which had been cleaned and converted into a classroom. Jeremiah Harrington had donated funds for books, slates, and supplies. The first teacher was Sarah, who taught herself to read using a Bible she'd stolen from the main house years ago. She stood in front of a class of 15 children, 10 black, 5 white, and taught them to read using the names from the witness tree. "Today we remember Elijah," she would say, pointing to one of the carved names. "He was a real person who lived and worked on this land. What happened to him wasn't right, but we make sure he's not forgotten by learning his name, by telling his story." The white children's parents were horrified at first. Teaching black and white children together was unheard of, possibly illegal depending on who you asked. But Sarah was patient, and the children were surprisingly open to learning together. And slowly, grudgingly, some of the parents began to accept it. Others did not. There were threats, there were attempts to burn down the school, there were letters to the authorities demanding it be shut down. But the school had powerful protectors. William Thatcher's articles in the Tribune had made the Harrington Plantation nationally famous, and abolitionists in the North sent money and support. The governor of Mississippi, nervous about negative attention from northern newspapers, quietly let it be known that the school should be left alone. And the witness tree continued to stand, its carved names visible to all who approached, a permanent reminder of what had happened on this ground. Jeremiah Harrington lived for 7 more years after that fateful night. He never recovered his wealth. The plantation never produced another crop, the land remaining stubbornly barren despite all attempts to cultivate it. But he kept his promise. He deeded parcels of land to former slaves who wanted to farm. He funded the school, even when it meant selling family heirlooms. He wrote letters to newspapers and politicians, describing what he'd witnessed, advocating for abolition with the zeal of a convert. His fellow planters shunned him. His family back in Charleston disowned him. The Southern society he'd once been part of considered him a traitor and a madman. But he didn't care. He'd seen too much, felt too much, to ever go back to who he'd been before. He died in the winter of 1851, alone in the main house that now stood empty and deteriorating. They found him in his study, slumped over his desk, a pen still in his hand. He'd been writing another letter, this one to Frederick Douglass, offering his support to the abolitionist cause. Old Benjamin outlived him by 3 months. At his funeral, held beneath the witness tree, over 100 people gathered to pay their respects. He'd become a legend in his own right, the man who'd witnessed the miracle, who'd seen Isaac and Martha disappear and return, who'd helped build something new from the ashes of slavery. As they lowered his body into the ground, Sarah led the crowd in singing one of the old spirituals, but with new verses added, verses about prayers answered, about justice delivered, about 2 souls who knelt before dawn and changed everything. The Civil War came, as everyone who'd witnessed the vision knew it would. The suffering wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But the story of the Harrington Plantation spread, carried by the people who'd been there, by the children taught in Sarah's school, by the articles William Thatcher continued to write, and the tree stood. Through the war, through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, and the long, brutal century that followed, the witness tree remained. The plantation buildings crumbled and were reclaimed by forest, but the tree endured. The land around it stayed barren, as if the earth itself refused to forget what had happened there. Travelers passing through would sometimes stop, drawn by stories they'd heard. They would approach the tree, run their fingers over the carved names, hundreds of them, impossibly preserved, never fading or weathering, despite the passage of time. And if they knelt in the grass where Isaac and Martha had knelt, if they prayed with sincere hearts, they would sometimes see. Not the full vision that had been granted to those first witnesses. That would have been too much for unprepared minds to bear. But glimpses, flashes of the truth, enough to understand, enough to remember, enough to carry the story forward. The Harrington Plantation Memorial Historic Site receives approximately 50,000 visitors per year. The main house was eventually rebuilt as a museum in 1978, and the grounds have been carefully maintained to honor the memory of those who suffered there. But the centerpiece remains the witness tree. It stands behind a low fence, protected but accessible, its trunk covered in carved names that no historian has been able to fully explain. The most thorough analysis suggests the carvings should be no more than 180 years old, but the technique doesn't match any known carving method from that period. The wood itself has been tested and retested. It's oak, certainly, but oak that shows no signs of decay, no damage from insects or weather, no signs of aging at all. Local guides tell the story of Isaac and Martha to tour groups, carefully noting which parts are historical fact and which are legend. They explain the vision, the reckoning, the transformation of the plantation from a site of horror to a place of remembrance and education. Most visitors listen politely, take photos, and leave, but some stay. Some kneel in the grass where Isaac and Martha knelt just before dawn, when the visitors' center isn't yet open. Some close their eyes and pray, not necessarily for miracles, but for understanding, for connection to a past that too often gets sanitized and forgotten. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they feel it, a warmth rising from the earth, a golden shimmer at the edge of vision, a sudden, overwhelming sense of presence, as if they're surrounded by hundreds of souls all waiting patiently for their stories to be heard, for their names to be spoken, for their suffering to be acknowledged. Marcus Washington, the site's current director and a descendant of slaves who worked on a neighboring plantation, has his own experience. He came to the tree on his first day at the job, wanting to pay his respects before beginning his work. He knelt, he prayed, and he saw just a flash, but it was enough. He saw a tall man and a graceful woman, holding hands, their faces turned toward a sunrise that promised something beyond suffering, and he heard two voices, faint as whispers on the wind, speaking words that have stayed with him ever since. Remember. Tell the story. Make it mean something. The documentary filmmaker arrived at the tree just before dawn, exactly 181 years, to the day after Isaac and Martha first disappeared. She'd been researching the Harrington Plantation for 2 years, collecting oral histories, interviewing descendants, trying to understand what really happened that June morning in 1844. She set up her camera facing east, toward the horizon where the sun would soon rise. The memorial site was empty. She'd gotten special permission to film before opening hours. In the pre-dawn darkness, the witness tree was just a massive silhouette against the slowly lightening sky. She checked her watch. 4:47 a.m. According to the historical records, this was the exact time Isaac and Martha had knelt to pray. On impulse, she turned on the camera, set it to record, and then did something she hadn't planned. She knelt in the grass, in the same spot where countless others had knelt before her, and closed her eyes. She wasn't a particularly religious person. She didn't really know what she was praying to or for, but she whispered into the darkness anyway, "If you're still here, if any part of you remains, I want to tell your story right. I want to make people understand. Help me remember. Help me bear witness." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the air changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The grass beneath her knees grew warm, not hot but comfortable, like sun-warmed earth on a summer day. And she felt something. A presence, multiple presences actually, all around her, watching, listening, waiting. She opened her eyes. The sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and in that golden light she saw them, not clearly, not solid, but there. Hundreds of translucent figures standing in the fields, their faces turned toward the sunrise, their mouths moving in silent prayer. Among them, clearly visible for just a moment, were two figures standing hand in hand beneath the witness tree, a tall man and a graceful woman, looking at her with expressions of infinite patience and infinite hope. The vision lasted only seconds. When she blinked, they were gone. But when she checked her camera later, she found that it had captured something, a strange golden glow surrounding the tree, and what looked like hundreds of light anomalies scattered across the field, each one roughly human-shaped. She knew no one would believe it was real. They'd say it was lens flare, camera malfunction, digital artifacts. And maybe they were right. Maybe it was just her imagination, influenced by the stories she'd been researching. But she knew what she'd felt. She knew what she'd seen, and she knew with absolute certainty that this story needed to be told.